The day I came home early and heard voices from my bedroom. When I opened the door, I saw my husband Daniel in our bed with my best friend Patricia. My heart stopped. This was it, the moment every wife dreads, catching your husband in the act of betrayal. But then I heard what they were actually saying to each other, and honey, instead of rage, I felt something I never expected. Sometimes the worst moment of your life turns out to be something completely different than what you think you're seeing. Before I tell you about that day and what I walked in on, I need to tell you about my friendship with Patricia and about my marriage to Daniel, because understanding those relationships is crucial to understanding why that moment turned out the way it did. Patricia and I had been best friends since we were 7 years old. We'd grown up 3 houses apart, spent every day together as children, went through school side by side. She was the sister I never had, the person who knew all my secrets, the one I called first with every piece of news, good or bad. We'd been through everything together. First crushes, first heartbreaks, high school drama, college struggles. When I got my nursing degree, Patricia was the one cheering loudest in the audience. When she started her catering business, I was her first employee, helping her set up for events on my days off. We'd been in each other's weddings. I'd been maid of honor when Patricia married Robert, and she'd been my maid of honor when I married Daniel. Our husbands became friends too, and the 4 of us spent countless weekends together, celebrating holidays and birthdays and just enjoying life. Patricia and Robert had 2 children, and I'd been there for both births, holding Patricia's hand through labor, crying when I first held each of her babies. Daniel and I had struggled with infertility for years, and Patricia had cried with me through every failed treatment, every negative pregnancy test, every loss. When Daniel and I finally accepted that we wouldn't have biological children and decided to focus on our careers and our life together, Patricia never made me feel less than because I didn't have kids. She included us in everything, made sure her children knew me as Auntie Loretta, never treated me like I was missing out on the most important parts of life. For 40 years, Patricia had been my constant, the one person besides Daniel who I trusted completely, the friend who'd never let me down, never betrayed me, never given me reason to doubt her loyalty. And Daniel, honey, Daniel was the love of my life. I'd met him when I was 32, working as a nurse at the hospital where he was a physical therapist. We'd bonded over our shared dedication to helping people, our similar values about what mattered in life. He was kind and patient and funny, the type of man who made me laugh even on my worst days. We'd been married for 23 years, and while our marriage wasn't perfect, whose is, it was strong. We communicated. We supported each other's dreams. We'd weathered the disappointment of infertility together and come out stronger for it. We still held hands, still went on date nights, still told each other, "I love you," every single day. Daniel got along well with Patricia and Robert. The 4 of us were like a family unit. We celebrated holidays together, took vacations together, supported each other through life's challenges. When Robert's father died, Daniel had been one of the pallbearers. When I'd had surgery 2 years ago, Patricia had stayed at our house for a week to help take care of me. So you need to understand, these were the 2 people I trusted most in the world. Daniel, my husband of 23 years, Patricia, my best friend of 40 years. The thought that either of them would betray me, let alone that they'd betray me together, had never even crossed my mind. Which made what I walked in on that Tuesday afternoon even more shocking. I'd been at work at the hospital, covering the day shift. About 2 hours before my shift was supposed to end, the charge nurse called me into her office. She said they were overstaffed for the evening and asked if I wanted to leave early. I jumped at the chance. I'd been feeling tired all week, and the thought of going home early, maybe taking a long bath, relaxing before Daniel got home from work, it sounded perfect. I texted Daniel to let him know I'd be home early, but he must have been with a patient because he didn't respond. I figured I'd surprise him later. Maybe I'd cook his favorite dinner, or we could go out for an early dinner together. When I pulled into our driveway at 3 in the afternoon, I noticed Patricia's car parked on the street. That wasn't unusual. Patricia had a key to our house and would sometimes stop by to drop off food she was testing for her catering business or just to visit if she was in the neighborhood. But something felt off. Patricia's car wasn't pulled into our driveway like it normally was. It was parked on the street, almost like she was trying to be less noticeable. And the curtains in our front window were drawn, which was odd for the middle of the day. I told myself I was being paranoid. There was probably a perfectly innocent explanation. Maybe Patricia had brought over a surprise and wanted to keep it hidden until the right moment. Maybe she was helping plan something for Daniel's upcoming birthday. I unlocked the front door and walked into the house quietly, not wanting to startle Patricia if she was working on some kind of surprise. The house was quiet, but I could hear voices coming from upstairs. From our bedroom, my heart started pounding. I told myself there was an explanation. Maybe Patricia was helping rearrange furniture. Maybe she was up there looking for something I'd borrowed from her. Maybe she was wrapping a gift and needed space to spread out. But even as I told myself these things, I was walking up the stairs, my stomach twisting with dread. The voices were getting clearer, Patricia's voice and Daniel's voice, both coming from our bedroom. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the hall toward our bedroom. The door was partially open. I could see shadows moving inside, hear murmured conversation. My hands were shaking as I pushed the door open wider. And there they were. My husband Daniel and my best friend Patricia, both in my bed. Honey, I cannot describe the feeling that washed over me in that moment. It was like the floor had dropped out from under me, like everything solid in my world had turned to liquid. The two people I trusted most, together in my bed, in the middle of the afternoon when they both thought I'd be at work. Every cliché I'd ever heard about catching a spouse cheating flashed through my mind, the sick feeling in the pit of your stomach. The sense of unreality, like you're watching a movie instead of living your life. The immediate thoughts, how long has this been going on? How could I not have known? Has our entire marriage been a lie? I must have made a sound, a gasp or a cry or something, because both of them turned to look at me. Patricia's face went pale. Daniel looked stricken, panicked. But then I actually looked at them, really looked, and I realized what I was seeing wasn't what I'd thought at first. They weren't naked. They were both fully clothed. Patricia was sitting on top of the covers, and Daniel was lying down, but he was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Patricia had on the yoga pants and sweater she always wore when she wasn't working. And they weren't touching intimately. Daniel had his head on the pillow, and Patricia was sitting next to him, holding his hand. Like a friend holding a friend's hand, not like lovers. Before I could process what I was actually seeing, before I could ask what was going on, I heard Daniel say something that made my blood run cold. I don't know how to tell her, Pat. How do I tell Loretta I'm dying? The room started spinning. I grabbed the doorframe to steady myself. Daniel's voice continued, choked with emotion. The doctor said 6 months, maybe a year if the treatment works. But the way he looked at me, Pat, I'm not going to make it. And Loretta's going to have to watch me die, and I don't know how to prepare her for that. Patricia's voice was thick with tears. Daniel, you have to tell her. You can't keep this from her. She needs time to process this, time to say everything she needs to say. You can't rob her of that. I know, Daniel said, and now he was crying openly. I know I need to tell her. But every time I try, I look at her and I see how happy she is, how she's planning our retirement, talking about traveling and all the things we're going to do together. How do I destroy that? How do I tell her that all those plans are never going to happen? Because she loves you, Patricia said firmly, and she deserves the truth. She deserves the chance to be with you through this, to fight this with you, to make whatever time you have left count. You're not protecting her by keeping this secret, you're just making it worse. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was hearing. Daniel was dying. My husband had been diagnosed with something terminal, and he'd been keeping it from me. He'd been carrying this terrible knowledge alone, except for Patricia, who he'd obviously confided in. The relief I felt that they weren't having an affair lasted for about 3 seconds before it was replaced by a much more devastating emotion, the realization that I was going to lose Daniel. Not to another woman, but to death. Not because he'd chosen to leave me, but because his body was betraying him. Daniel saw me then, standing in the doorway, his face crumpled. "Loretta, oh God, you're home. You weren't supposed to. I was going to tell you. I was going to tell you tonight, I swear. Pat was helping me figure out how." Patricia stood up quickly, looking guilty and worried. "Loretta, I'm so sorry. Daniel made me promise not to say anything. He wanted to tell you himself, but he was struggling with how to do it, and I was trying to help him find the words." I walked into the room on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. I sat down on the bed next to Daniel. I took his other hand, the one Patricia wasn't holding, and I asked him to tell me everything. And honey, he did. He told me that 3 months ago he'd started having symptoms: fatigue, weight loss, pain in his abdomen. He'd gone to the doctor thinking maybe it was an ulcer or something treatable. Instead, they'd found cancer, pancreatic cancer, already stage 4 by the time they caught it. The doctors had been frank with him. Pancreatic cancer at that stage was essentially a death sentence. They could try chemotherapy, could try to slow it down, but the 5-year survival rate was less than 3%. Most people with stage 4 pancreatic cancer died within a year of diagnosis. Daniel had been reeling from the diagnosis, trying to process it himself before bringing me into his nightmare. He'd been seeing an oncologist, getting tests done, trying to understand his options. And he'd confided in Patricia because he'd needed someone to talk to, someone who could help him figure out how to tell me without destroying me. He said he'd been planning to tell me that very evening. He'd taken the afternoon off work, and Patricia had come over to help him practice what he was going to say. They'd come upstairs because he wanted to imagine us having the conversation in our bedroom, in private, where I'd feel safe to fall apart if I needed to. I asked him why he'd waited 3 months to tell me, why he'd gone through appointments and consultations and terrible news without me by his side. Daniel said he'd been in denial at first, thinking maybe there'd been a mistake, maybe the diagnosis was wrong. Then he'd been trying to gather information, to understand what we were facing before bringing me into it. Then he'd been terrified of hurting me, of watching my heart break when he told me. "I know I should have told you right away," he said, crying. "I know I should have let you come to appointments with me, should have let you be part of this from the beginning. But Loretta, the thought of seeing your face when I told you I was dying, I couldn't do it. I couldn't bear to be the person who destroyed your world." Patricia was crying too. She said she'd been begging Daniel for weeks to tell me, that she'd hated keeping this secret from me, but that Daniel had made her promise. She said she'd almost told me a dozen times, but had respected Daniel's wish to be the one to tell me himself. I sat there on our bed holding my husband's hand, with my best friend on his other side, and I tried to process the information I'd just been given. My husband was dying. I had months, maybe a year, to say everything I needed to say to him, to be with him, to help him through what was coming. And in that moment, honey, through the devastation and the terror and the grief that was already beginning, I felt something else. Gratitude. Gratitude that I'd walked in on them, that I'd been sent home early from work, that I'd discovered the truth before Daniel had spent another day carrying this burden alone. Gratitude that my husband hadn't been cheating on me. That when I'd opened that bedroom door expecting betrayal, what I'd found instead was my husband seeking comfort from my best friend as he tried to figure out how to tell me the worst news of our lives. Gratitude that Patricia had been there for him when I couldn't be, because I didn't know, that she'd given him a safe place to process his fear and grief. That she'd been pushing him to tell me, to bring me into this so we could face it together. And most of all, gratitude that I still had time. Time to be with Daniel, time to fight this together, time to make memories and say everything that needed to be said. It might only be months, But it was more than I'd have if he died suddenly, without warning, leaving things unsaid. I told Daniel that I loved him, that I was angry he'd kept this from me, but that I understood why, that we were going to face this together, whatever came next. That I wasn't going anywhere, that I'd be by his side through every appointment, every treatment, every hard day. Patricia started to leave, to give us privacy, but I asked her to stay. She'd been part of this from the beginning, had carried this burden with Daniel when I couldn't. She was family, and I needed her there. The three of us sat on that bed and cried together. We cried for the unfairness of it all, for the future that was being stolen from us, for the pain that was coming. But we also held each other, drew strength from each other, began the process of facing this terrible thing as a family. Over the next few days, I called out of work, and Daniel and I went together to meet with his oncologist. I learned all the details I'd missed by not being there from the beginning. I asked all the questions Daniel hadn't thought to ask. I took notes, researched treatment options, became his advocate in navigating the medical system. We decided to try the chemotherapy, even though the odds were terrible, not because we thought it would save him, but because we needed to feel like we were fighting, like we weren't just giving up. Daniel started treatment the following week, and I was there for every session, holding his hand through the nausea and exhaustion that followed. We told our families and close friends about the diagnosis. My parents were devastated. Daniel's siblings came to visit. Our friends rallied around us with meals and support and presents. Patricia and Robert were there constantly, helping in whatever ways they could. The hardest part was telling people. Each time we had to say the words, "Daniel has cancer," and "it's terminal," it made it more real. We couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't live in denial. This was happening, and everyone we loved needed to know. But there was something beautiful in that, too. In the months that followed, we were surrounded by so much love. People showed up for us in ways we never could have imagined. Friends we hadn't seen in years reached out. Daniel's former patients sent cards and letters. Our community wrapped around us like a protective blanket. Daniel and I talked about everything in those months. We stayed up late having conversations we'd been putting off for years about our regrets, our proudest moments, our love for each other. We looked through photo albums and remembered our life together. We made plans for my future without him, as painful as that was, because Daniel wanted to know I'd be okay. We did some traveling, while Daniel still felt well enough. Nothing elaborate, just weekend trips to places within driving distance that we'd always meant to visit. We saw fall foliage in the mountains, spent a weekend at the beach, visited the city where we'd met, and walked the streets of our early romance. Patricia came with us on some of those trips, along with Robert. The four of us had one last perfect weekend together, laughing and telling stories and pretending for a little while that everything was normal. We celebrated Christmas early that year, in November, because the doctors weren't sure Daniel would make it to the actual holiday. We decorated the house, exchanged gifts, had a feast with family. Daniel was tired and thin and clearly sick, but he smiled through the whole day. By January, Daniel was in hospice care at home. The cancer had spread, and the pain was getting harder to manage. I'd taken a leave of absence from work to be with him full-time. Patricia came over every day, helping me care for him, giving me breaks when I needed them. Robert and Patricia's children came to visit, bringing youth and energy into our quiet house. Daniel's siblings visited frequently. Friends stopped by with food and flowers and their presents. Our house became a place of gathering, of people coming together to say goodbye and to celebrate the life Daniel had lived. In mid-February, 6 months after I'd walked in on Daniel and Patricia in our bedroom, Daniel died peacefully in our bed with me holding his hand. Patricia was there too, along with Daniel's brother and my parents. We were all there to see him off, to tell him one last time that he was loved. The grief was crushing. Losing Daniel felt like losing half of myself, but even in the depths of that grief, I was grateful for those 6 months. Grateful that I'd come home early that day. Grateful that I'd overheard the conversation that revealed the truth. Grateful for every moment I'd had with Daniel once I knew. Because here's what I realized, honey. If Daniel had kept his diagnosis secret, if he'd hidden it from me until he couldn't hide it anymore, I would have lost time with him. Time to really be present, to say what needed saying, to make memories knowing they were the last memories. If I'd walked in on Daniel and Patricia and they really had been having an affair, my marriage would have ended in betrayal instead of love. I would have spent Daniel's last months feeling hurt and angry instead of cherished and connected. But what I actually walked in on was my husband seeking help from my best friend to figure out how to tell me devastating news without breaking me. I walked in on love, not romantic love, but the deep love of friendship and loyalty. I walked in on Daniel trying to protect me even as he was dying, and Patricia trying to convince him that I was strong enough to face the truth. In that moment when I first opened the bedroom door and saw them together, my mind went to the worst possible explanation: cheating, betrayal, the destruction of everything I'd believed in. For about 30 seconds I thought my world was ending for that reason. Then I heard what they were actually saying, and I learned my world was ending for a completely different reason. Not because of betrayal, but because of mortality. Not because Daniel didn't love me, but because his body was failing him. And honey, as strange as it sounds, that made me smile. Not a happy smile, it wasn't a moment of joy, but a smile of relief that this wasn't betrayal. A smile of gratitude that I'd discovered the truth in time to be with Daniel through his final months. A smile of love for my husband who'd been trying to protect me, and for my friend who'd been trying to protect both of us. That smile confused the hell out of Daniel and Patricia in the moment. They couldn't understand why I was smiling after hearing that Daniel was dying. But I explained it to them later, after the initial shock had worn off, after we'd all cried ourselves dry. I smiled because what I'd found in that bedroom wasn't the worst thing. It was actually the best possible version of the terrible situation we were facing. I found love, and friendship, and people trying to do right by each other. I found Daniel being brave enough to seek help. I found Patricia being loyal enough to keep a painful secret while pushing Daniel to tell the truth. In the 2 years since Daniel died, I've thought a lot about that day. About the moment I opened the bedroom door expecting one kind of heartbreak and found another. About how our worst fears sometimes turn out to be unfounded, but that doesn't mean we're not facing something terrible anyway. I'm grateful I walked in on them that day. If I hadn't, Daniel might have waited longer to tell me, and I'd have lost more of those precious final months to his secret keeping. If I'd come home at my regular time, I wouldn't have overheard that conversation, and Daniel would have told me his news in whatever way he'd rehearsed, but I wouldn't have seen how much he loved me, how much he wanted to protect me from pain. I'm grateful for Patricia, who kept my husband's confidence while also pushing him to tell me, who was there for both of us through those terrible months, who helped me care for Daniel when he got too sick for me to do it alone, who cried with me at the funeral and helped me sort through Daniel's belongings and still calls me every week to make sure I'm okay. I'm grateful that when I thought I was walking in on an affair, what I actually walked in on was love in its purest form, people trying to care for each other through impossible circumstances. The story I'm telling you isn't the story I thought I'd be telling when I started. When I say I walked in on my husband and my best friend in our bed, everyone expects the rest to be about betrayal and divorce and how I got revenge on them both. But this story is about something else. It's about how sometimes what looks like the worst thing can actually be a gift. How sometimes when we expect to find betrayal, we find loyalty instead. How sometimes the moment we think will destroy us actually gives us what we need to survive. If I'd never walked in on Daniel and Patricia that day, if I'd stayed at work and Daniel had told me that evening as he'd planned, things would have been fine. I still would have had those 6 months with him. I still would have been by his side through treatment and decline and death. But I wouldn't have had that moment of understanding how much he loved me so much that telling me he was dying felt harder to him than dying itself. I wouldn't have seen him vulnerable and scared, seeking comfort from my best friend, trying to find the words to break my heart as gently as possible. That moment, as terrible as it was, showed me the depth of Daniel's love in a way that 23 years of marriage hadn't quite captured. He loved me so much that he'd carried this devastating secret for 3 months because he couldn't bear to hurt me. He loved me so much that when he finally knew he had to tell me, he sought help from my best friend to find the gentlest way possible. And Patricia's presence in that moment showed me the depth of her friendship. She could have betrayed Daniel's confidence and told me herself, saving herself from the guilt of keeping such a huge secret. But she'd respected his need to tell me himself while also pushing him not to wait too long. She'd been there for him when he needed someone and had earned his trust by keeping his confidence. These days, when Patricia and I talk about that day, we sometimes laugh at the absurdity of it. She says she'll never forget the look on my face when I first opened the door, pure horror and heartbreak. Then confusion, as I realized they weren't doing what I thought. Then devastation as I heard what was actually happening. But we also talk about how that moment changed everything in the best possible way under terrible circumstances. How it gave us the opening to face Daniel's diagnosis together instead of him facing it alone first. How it brought the three of us together in honesty instead of one person on the outside of a secret. I tell people now that the worst moment of my life turned out to be a gift. They don't understand until I explain the whole story. How I thought I was catching my husband cheating, how what I actually caught was him trying to figure out how to tell me he was dying. No one expects that twist. Everyone expects the story to be about an affair, about betrayal, about revenge or forgiveness or divorce. Instead, it's a story about love and death and the strange ways that grace can appear in our darkest moments. The day I walked in on my husband and my best friend in our bed should have been the day my marriage ended. Instead, it was the day my marriage entered its most profound chapter, the one where we faced death together with honesty and love and gratitude for every moment we had left. I smiled that day not because anything was funny or good, but because in that moment of expecting betrayal and finding something else, I understood that I was loved more deeply than I'd fully realized. Daniel loved me enough to want to protect me from pain, even when that protection was impossible. Patricia loved me enough to help my husband find the words to tell me the truth. That smile wasn't joy. It was relief and gratitude and love all mixed together in a moment of terrible understanding. It was the smile of someone who expected the worst kind of betrayal and found the best kind of love instead. And honey, that's the story I wanted to tell you. Not about affairs and revenge and broken trust, but about the moment I thought my world was ending one way and discovered it was ending another way entirely, and how that difference, that particular kind of honesty and love, made all the difference in how we faced what came next. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more true stories about love, loss, and finding grace in unexpected places. Have you ever discovered that something you feared turned out to be completely different than you thought? Have you lost a spouse to illness or helped someone navigate a terminal diagnosis? Have you had a best friend who showed up for you during your darkest times in ways you never could have imagined? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories matter, and this community is here to support each other through life's most difficult moments. Remember, sometimes what looks like betrayal is actually love in disguise. Sometimes the worst moments reveal the deepest connections. And sometimes the gift isn't in avoiding pain, it's in facing it together with people who truly love us. If someone you love is facing a terminal diagnosis, don't let them carry that burden alone. Be present, ask questions, make every moment count. And if you're the one who's sick, don't rob your loved ones of the chance to be there for you by keeping secrets out of a misguided desire to protect them. They deserve the truth, and they deserve to walk this journey with you. Take care of yourselves, cherish the people you love, and I'll see you in the next story.